It is the most modern passenger jet that we have today, and its lightweight materials, cutting-edge cockpit and comfortable passenger seats is a true breath of fresh air in a world full of re-engined and updated old airliners. So why would anyone claim that the wonderful Airbus A220 could actually be a developmental dead end? Stay tuned. I have featured this aircraft on several videos on this channel, and most recently I talked about it in a video about Spirit Aerosystems, which is making key parts of the Airbus A220, including its wings. But Spirit is primarily a Boeing supplier, making fuselage parts and other components for all Boeing airliners, including the entire fuselage of the 737 that I fly. And that is having some serious implications, since Boeing now wants to buy Spirit, or at least part of it. Now, I'll get back to that a bit later, but for now I want to explain the origin tale behind the Airbus A220, because understanding that will give us a big clue about why its future might be at risk. As I'm sure many of you guys already know, Airbus didn't come up with this aircraft themselves. This beauty was instead designed by Bombardier in Canada in order to fill a looming gap in the aircraft market. Around 20 years ago, Bombardier observed that Boeing and Airbus had started making narrow-body aircraft that seemed to be getting bigger and bigger as time went by. Now, the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320 families did include some smaller variants, but those designs were typically optimized for the weight of the bigger and longer versions of the same aircraft. This meant that the smaller variants, like the Boeing 737-6 and 700 and the Airbus A318 and 19, were a bit heavier than they needed to be for the same number of passengers that they could carry, and that would obviously make them slightly less efficient. Meanwhile, some of the other, even older types who were smaller were all either going out of production or had already stopped being produced. An example of that was the Boeing 717, the last member of the MD-80 family, who would go out of production in 2006, while the Fokker 100 and the Avro RJ were still in service but not being made anymore. The Bombardier engineers believed that if they took care to fit their next aircraft with the latest engine technology and also made it as efficient as they possibly could, well, then they could make it into something that would be more than just a short-haul or a regional aircraft. Obviously, the newer engines in themselves would make the plane a more attractive proposition for the airlines, but the lower fuel burn would also give the aircraft a longer range, allowing it to operate to connect more medium-sized or small commercial airports to each other. Now, I'm not going to go in to explain the hub and spoke versus point-to-point operating models again in this video, but you can see how the Bombardier design, which would later be known as the C-Series, fitted the point-to-point model quite well, and that was at a time when that model was already slowly gaining in popularity. The fact that the C-Series would be able to take on this role was severely misunderstood at the time, which maybe wasn't that surprising. Obviously, Bombardier was primarily known for business jets, turboprops and regional aircraft, and many, including Boeing and Airbus initially, therefore dismissed the C-Series as just another somewhat overgrown regional jet. Now, finding the right engine took a while, but Bombardier eventually struck a deal with Pratt & Whitney for a version of the PW1000G geared turbofan family called the PW1500G. With that, the C-Series was officially launched at the Farnborough Air Show back in 2008. But from the outset, the program faced a lot of problems, including a fairly unrealistic budget. During their initial feasibility studies, Bombardier had predicted that the C-Series would cost around $2.1 billion to develop. And also that this cost would be shared with the governments who had invested and supported the project. This obviously included Canada and Quebec's regional government, but also the UK government, since the plane's wings would be made in Belfast by the then Bombardier-owned Short Aircraft Company. But those development costs ballooned very quickly after the program launched, and in 2009, the projection was that the true cost would instead hover around $3.5 billion. More state funding followed to keep the program aloft, and by the time the plane was finally certified in 2015, its development costs had grown to a staggering $5.4 billion. Later investments on production infrastructure and more government help would raise the total program cost to $7 billion by 2020, But already in 2018, Airbus had stepped in and officially taken over the program, renaming the C-Series into the Airbus A220. Now, when looking at this story, most people, myself included, have previously focused mainly on the standoff between Bombardier and Boeing, which eventually led to Airbus entering the picture and allowing them to snatch a controlling stake of the C-Series, basically for free. And today, the C-Series is considered to be a quite successful aircraft, especially after some early engine-related issues were resolved. Unfortunately, the more recent Pratt & Whitney engine issues haven't appeared to have any effect on the A220, at least as far as we know so far. But even if the plane is working just fine, their passengers and crews are happy, and new orders are coming in, Airbus is still making these planes at a loss. So why is that? Well, it turns out that there are a number of reasons behind that, including some quite bad production inefficiencies. Bombardier didn't have much experience in building a large aircraft like this, which has made its production unnecessarily slow and cumbersome compared to especially Boeing and Airbus. And I'll give you one example. Boeing has the nose sections of all of their jets made by Spirit AeroSystems before shipping them off to their final assembly sites. But a lot of the wiring, hydraulic lines, flight deck equipment, installations and other parts that Boeing gets from other suppliers are already being fitted to those sections while they are being worked on at Spirit. This pre-stuffing saves a lot of time when the fuselage, along with its wings and other components, make it to the final assembly line. And Airbus are also doing something similar, but as Scott Hamilton in Leham News explains, they only started implementing this to the Airbus A220 program in 2021. But this wasn't the only problem. As a relatively small manufacturer, Bombardier didn't have the kind of high standing to properly negotiate favorable part supplier contracts in the same way as Airbus and Boeing could. This meant that a lot of the parts are more expensive than they would have been if Airbus would have been able to negotiate those contracts themselves. Now, Airbus has ended up needing quite some time to sort this out after they took the airplane over, and obviously the Airbus A220 is also still a North American design, with much of its supply chain stuck in North America, and that's also a little bit of a headache for Airbus. But even with all of those issues in mind, the fact still remains that the Airbus A220 is a more efficient aircraft than any of the smaller Boeing or Airbus models out there. The larger A220-300 is even stealing some sales from the Airbus A320neo at the moment, and Bombardier designed that plane with an even bigger stretch in mind, and if that happens, it would align even more with the Airbus A320neo and the Boeing 737 MAX 8. So, if this aircraft is better than what we have right now, then why would it be a dead end? Why wouldn't it eventually be developed to replace Airbus's current generations of narrowbodies? Well, as it turns out, some of those developmental problems, along with emerging aircraft production methods and a lot of Airbus strategy, could ultimately prove too important for this design to enjoy a longer career, and I'll explain why after this. I travel quite a lot since I'm a pilot, and if you've been following my channel for a while, this won't come as a surprise to you, but just hear me out. Whenever I'm out on the go, there is one thing that I always recommend doing, and that's making sure that my computer thinks that I'm still at home. That way, everything online works as I am used to, including banking, my favorite websites, and all other online content. But sometimes I actually want to do the opposite of that. I want my computer to think that I'm somewhere else so I can access better deals on flights, hotels, and rental cars. This is where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in, because with their help I can virtually move anywhere I want at a click of a button. As the summer travel season is soon here, Nord is an essential tool, not just to find great prices, but also to help surf the web privately and securely, especially when using unknown Wi-Fi networks in restaurants, hotels, or maybe airports. Nord has lately also added loads of great cybersecurity tools, making them much more than just a normal VPN. And if you want to try them out, then use the link here below, which is nordvpn.com/mentor now. This will give you 4 free months when you sign up for the 2-year deal. And remember, you can test them completely risk-free for up to 30 days with a full refund if you are not completely satisfied. Thank you, NordVPN. Now back to the video. To understand why the position of the A220 in the Airbus lineup is a bit uncertain, we must first look at how Airbus goes about making the A220 today, and then compare that with the way they're making the Airbus A320s. As I've explained in many of my previous videos, Airbus are, at the moment, using different aerostructure manufacturing sites around Europe to make different parts of their aircraft. Now, there are some parts, for example the Airbus A350, that are made in the United States, but I believe that almost all of the major structural parts for the Airbus A320 family are made in Europe. And by the way, if you think that I'm wrong about that, let me know in the comments below and send me a like when you're down there. These kind of discussions, by the way, where I'm kind of doubting, is very, very similar to the kind of discussions that we have on my Patreon hangouts that we do a couple of times a month. I'd love to see you guys there the next time, so sign up. There should be a link somewhere in the description below. Anyway, all of these parts are then shipped by sea, land or air to one of Airbus's many final assembly lines, or FALs, where they are then put together into a completed aircraft, and this is typically quite efficient. But as I said earlier, the Airbus A220 is different in this regard, both because of where it comes from, but another big difference is just its scale. The first A220s, when the program was still called the C series, were made in Bombardier's Mirabel facility in Quebec, and that's still where the main production of the A220 takes place. A second Finnish assembly line has opened in Alabama, and when you put these two sites together, well, then they have the capacity to produce around 14 A220s per month. But just because that's the theoretical capacity, that doesn't mean that they're actually making aircraft at that rate. Airbus hopes to reach these numbers in the next year or so, and if they do, then maybe finally this program will become profitable. That maybe is because there are also other profitability issues to work out, and that brings me back to what I said in the beginning about Boeing and its desire to buy back Spirit AeroSystems. As it happens, Spirit is now the owner of that factory in Belfast, which is currently making the A220 wing. Now obviously Airbus doesn't want Boeing to own that factory, and Boeing, who is trying to reintegrate Spirit as cheaply as possible, doesn't really want an Airbus wing factory either. So that means that Boeing and Airbus now need to try to figure out how to split Spirit AeroSystems, something that I've already done a video about previously. But of course, it's not that simple. In that other video that I did, I said that by buying that wing factory in Belfast, Airbus would effectively be doing Boeing a favor by reducing the total purchase price of Spirit. And as it turns out, that fact has now dawned on Airbus as well. And not only that, the deal would likely be an even bigger favor to Boeing than it looks on the onset, since the factory is currently producing those Airbus A220 wings at a loss. So, in May, we learned that Airbus now doesn't simply want to buy that wing factory. They want to be compensated for taking it over, since it would require additional investments of about $1 billion to make it break even. And it will now be really interesting to see just how this pans out over the next coming months. Now, before this Spirit issue cropped out, Airbus' longer-term target for the Airbus A220 production was to reach 20 or more aircraft per month from the year 2026. And it's not clear how this new supplier situation might affect that timeline. But either way, by 2026, Airbus wants to be producing around 75 Airbus A320 family aircraft per month, across as many as 10 final assembly lines worldwide. That's one reason why Airbus might still be reluctant to let the A220 cannibalize sales away from the Airbus A320 Neo family, even though Airbus are making A320s and 321s as fast as they possibly can, and they will probably keep doing so for many years to come. But when you look at those numbers, it's quite clear that the entire Airbus supply and production infrastructure is revolving around the Airbus A320 Neo family. It's just as easy as that. Now, you might think that the relatively low production of the Airbus A220 could simply be a childhood problem, which will be ironed out over time. After all, the A220 program has a total of over 900 orders so far, with a backlog of well over 500. But it's not just the production infrastructure for the A320 Neo family that could cause problems for the future of the A220. Another problem here is the way that Airbus have evolved their entire aircraft fleet to facilitate things for their customers in terms of training and even maintenance between aircraft types. You see, normally each airliner family comes with its own individual pilot type rating, and any pilot who wants to operate that family needs to go through that. There are some cases where different models share a type rating thanks to similarities in their flight decks and systems, like the Boeing 777 and 787 and the Airbus A330 and the 340, for example. But Airbus has gone one step further and also designed their cockpits and other systems between aircraft types to look, feel and act very similar. The reason for that is very clever. You see, if the cockpits are similar and the fly-by-wire technology makes the aircraft act very similar in the air, well, then an abbreviated type rating is enough to switch a pilot between the Airbus A320 to the much bigger A330, for example. What this means in practice is that instead of going through the around 2-month-long full type rating, an Airbus A320 pilot can transfer to an A330 by following a much shorter process called a cross-crew qualification, which typically takes less than a week. Now, Airbus went through a lot of trouble to make sure this was the case across all aircraft they have made since the Airbus A320. That includes the A330, 340 and even the A350 with the A380. This gives potentially huge benefits to airlines using several Airbus types and create a moat around their fleets. Because of this, some airlines have even introduced mixed fleet flying procedures, allowing pilots to fly both the A320 and the A380 families within the same airline, which is very, very cool. In practice though, not all airlines routinely swap their pilots between types this way, but the ability to do so and the limited time required even for a simple transition between types is a potential massive saving in training. So where does the Airbus A220 fit into this process then? Well, the short answer is that it really doesn't. It is true that it uses a fly-by-wire design and side stick like the rest of the Airbus fleet, but it is an entirely different aircraft design and philosophy with its own entirely different systems and of course a totally separate type rating. This obviously made sense when it was developed, since Bombardier had no reason to even try to make its type rating the same as for the Airbus fleet, but this also means that the A220 now stands a bit alone in the Airbus ecosystem. So with that in mind, let's think a little bit about what any further development of the A220 family might look like. As I said earlier, Bombardier designed the plane with a future fuselage stretch in mind, although that would require finding a bit more powerful engines. If we assume that finding those engines isn't a problem, then Airbus could launch the stretch model as soon as the A220 production is finally profitable. That's because of those commonality issues that I've just explained, but also because of some other longer-term fleet plans that might actually stop any further development, and this is where things start to get really interesting. We know by now that both Airbus and Boeing would like to introduce their next all-new airliners as sometime near the middle of next decade. We know that they are planning for that because of emerging engine technologies like the CFM RISE, which neither manufacturer can afford to ignore. But more importantly, that next aircraft design won't be just one aircraft model. Instead, it will be the first member of a completely new aircraft family, whose systems should be modern enough to make it compatible with existing or future aircraft families. So then, if that new aircraft will have to be backward compatible, what Airbus design do you think the company will draw from? What supply chain will be used to make it, and where do you think it will be assembled? I think you can probably see why, despite its modern design, the Airbus A220 might not be the obvious choice here, especially if you consider the sheer number of Airbus A320, A330, 340 and 380 aircraft flying today, and how many pilots that would be affected. Now you might say, well, okay Peter, but that still doesn't explain why Airbus wouldn't even want to do the stretch A220, especially if the engineering and design work for that one has already been done. Well, here we have another factor that might spoil the party for aircraft and airlines like Air France, Breeze and probably JetBlue who really would like to buy it. And that's the future cost and speed of development of newer aircraft. You see, on average, developing an all-new airliner takes around 7 years at the moment, and that's if everything goes well, which is a very big if. But for years now, both Boeing and Airbus have been working on plans to try and reduce this average time to a much shorter period. Boeing tried this with the development of the 787 and failed badly. But the theory is that as digital design tools gets better, implementing and certifying new designs in the future should become much simpler and faster. At the same time, manufacturers are also trying to introduce more cost-efficient ways to produce lightweight composite structures, using techniques like the out-of-autoclave manufacturing, for example. And when that technology becomes fully viable, it will make those kinds of parts cheaper and quicker to produce and allow production to scale up and down with demand more easily. Obviously, this is a really complicated issue, which I'm severely oversimplifying here, but if you want to read more details about it, you should check out Björn Färm's aircraft development series over on Leham News. It's absolutely fantastic. So, if we put all of these developments together, this means that if Airbus and Boeing manages to pull this off, then they will be able to introduce all new, super efficient, cheaper to produce aircraft much faster than they can right now. And they will also cost less to bring to market and therefore be quicker to break even. So if that happens, will even a stretched A220 be worth it for Airbus, or should they just go straight for a completely new design, aligned with the rest of their legacy lineup? Again, there are a lot of ifs here, and Björn has also listed quite a few more over in his series. But the one thing that we do know is that both Boeing and Airbus are busy working on new aircraft designs that will suit the CFM RISE engine, and they should be ready to enter service in a little over a decade from now. So fast development or not, something is definitely coming, and whether or not Airbus will want or need a stretched A220, well, it depends on how quickly it will actually become profitable, and on whether or not Boeing, in the meantime, will do something that will force Airbus's hand. If Boeing manages to turn around its fortunes and launch an all-new aircraft quicker, then Airbus might have to react. And in that scenario, it's far from certain that a stretched Airbus A220 will be the right answer. What do you think though? What does the future hold for the A220? Let me know in the comments here below, or join my Patreon crew if you want to discuss this directly with me in our next hangout. You can also support my work by sending a super thanks, buy some merch, or by checking out my sponsor. Everything really helps. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Airbus would effectively be doing Boeing a favor by reducing the total purchase price of Spirit, right?